It started with a rumor. The kind that drifts through the halls of an old school, whispered between lockers, passed from one nervous glance to another. Some said it was just a storage area. Others swore it was a sealed-off tunnel, a leftover from decades ago when the building was something entirely different. On a cold, rainy afternoon, Ethan Price heard it for the first time. He was leaning against the wall outside the library when a group of seniors walked past, speaking in hushed tones. One of them mentioned a door in the basement, not a regular door. This one was low to the ground, hidden behind a row of battered metal cabinets. And it wasn't on any of the school's blueprints. Ethan had been at Brookford High for only a year, but he already knew it had layers. The place was over 100 years old, its brick walls weathered, its staircases creaking under the weight of time. Teachers avoided talking about its history, and the janitors never seemed to linger in the basement for long. That night, lying in bed, the thought wouldn't leave him: why would a school have a tunnel? Where did it go? And why, after all these years, had it never been mentioned in any official tour or assembly? The questions itched at the back of his mind until they became something heavier, something that felt like a pull. The next morning, when the rain had turned to a thin mist, he made up his mind. He would go down there, not after class, not with a group, alone. Because sometimes the answers you find are the ones no one else is willing to look for. The basement wasn't easy to reach. Access was through a narrow stairwell near the cafeteria, a place most students ignored because of the damp smell and the way the fluorescent light flickered without rhythm. As Ethan descended the steps, the air grew cooler, carrying that musty scent of old concrete and forgotten things. Down here, the hum of the school above faded into silence. He passed a stack of unused desks, a cart of dusty textbooks, and a vending machine that hadn't worked in years. The far wall was lined with tall, dented cabinets, exactly like the seniors had described. He ran his fingers along the cold metal until he found it, one cabinet pushed slightly forward, leaving a thin gap behind. Pulling it aside was harder than he expected. The legs scraped against the floor with a metallic groan that echoed through the empty space. Behind it, there it was, a small, weathered wooden door no more than 4 feet high with peeling green paint and a rusted latch. Ethan crouched down, his pulse quickening. The latch came loose with a stubborn twist, sending a flake of rust to the floor. Beyond the door, the darkness was thick, almost tangible. He clicked on the flashlight from his phone, the beam cutting a narrow path into the unknown. It wasn't just a crawlspace. A short tunnel stretched ahead, its walls lined with bricks darkened by age and damp. The floor sloped gently downward, disappearing into shadow. For a moment he hesitated, every instinct telling him this was a place meant to stay hidden, and yet he stepped inside. The tunnel seemed to swallow the light as Ethan moved forward, each step sending a dull echo back toward the basement. The air was colder here, damp enough that it clung to his skin. His sneakers scuffed against uneven bricks, and more than once he had to duck beneath low wooden beams, their surfaces splintered and dark with age. A few yards in, he noticed faint markings on the walls, chalk lines faded almost to nothing. They looked like arrows, each pointing deeper into the passage. He followed them, though every logical part of his brain told him to turn around. Somewhere ahead, a drip of water echoed, rhythmic and steady. The tunnel widened slightly, enough for him to straighten up. That's when his phone light caught something strange, a scrap of paper caught between 2 bricks. He pulled it free carefully, the edges crumbling under his touch. The writing was messy, hurried, like it had been scrawled in a rush. Only 3 words were legible: "Don't go back." His chest tightened. A sound, soft, almost like the brushing of fabric, came from farther down. He froze, holding his breath. The beam of his flashlight trembled in his grip, catching glimpses of the tunnel's end and what looked like the outline of a door. Not a door like the one upstairs, but heavy, reinforced, with metal studs that glinted in the dim light. The fabric-like sound came again, closer this time, and before he could convince himself to retreat, his hand was already reaching for the handle. The handle was cold, almost unnaturally so, as if the metal had been untouched for years. Ethan's fingers hesitated around it, his pulse thudding in his ears. With a slow turn, the latch gave way with a muted click, and the heavy door creaked inward. The sound echoed down the tunnel, followed by a wave of air that smelled faintly of dust and something older, something he couldn't name. He stepped inside cautiously, the beam of his phone sweeping across the space. It wasn't what he expected. The room was larger than any basement storage area should be, with a low ceiling supported by thick wooden beams. The floor was bare concrete, littered with scraps of paper, empty glass jars, and the occasional rusted tool. Against the far wall stood a wooden desk, its surface warped, drawers slightly open as if someone had been searching through them not long ago. Ethan's light landed on a row of photographs pinned haphazardly to a corkboard. The edges were curled, the colors faded, but the images were clear enough. Students, all wearing the same outdated uniforms, lined up in front of the Schule building. None of the faces were familiar. Some photos were dated, going back decades. Others had no dates at all, but in several of them, Ethan noticed the same thing: one figure standing at the edge, slightly apart from the rest. A tall man in a dark coat, his face always turned just enough to hide in shadow. A sudden creak from the tunnel made him whirl around, the light jerking toward the doorway. The air seemed heavier now, the silence sharper. He swallowed hard, realizing for the first time, he wasn't sure he'd come down here alone. Ethan's breath caught, his ears straining for any hint of movement. The creak had been real, too distinct to be his imagination. Slowly he backed toward the desk, keeping his flashlight aimed at the doorway. The beam wavered over the rough brick walls, the open tunnel beyond, but nothing moved. Still, the feeling of being watched clung to him. His pulse quickened, each heartbeat loud in his chest. He forced himself to look back at the desk, rifling through the drawers in search of anything. Most were filled with brittle papers, ledgers with handwriting so faded it was barely legible. But in the bottom drawer, beneath a layer of dust, he found something unexpected: a small, leather-bound notebook. Its cover was cracked, the leather dry and peeling. Inside, the pages were filled with neat handwriting, each entry dated. The earliest ones described routine maintenance, the kind you might expect from a custodian or groundskeeper. But as the dates moved forward, the tone changed. Notes about after-hours gatherings, selected students, and the caretaker's approval appeared more frequently. One entry in particular made his stomach turn. It was dated March 12, 1974. The words were simple but chilling: the door must stay locked. Too many questions lately. If they find the other room. The rest of the sentence was smeared, as if the ink had been deliberately smudged. Ethan glanced toward the far corner of the underground room, where a section of wall looked different. The bricks there were cleaner, newer, like they'd been replaced more recently than the rest. And just as he started toward it, the sound came again, this time not a creak but a slow, deliberate step, from inside the tunnel. The step was followed by another, slow and measured, as if whoever, or whatever, was out there didn't care about being heard. Ethan's throat tightened. His flashlight beam swung toward the tunnel entrance, slicing through the darkness, but it revealed nothing. The silence that followed was worse than the sound itself, thick and pressing in on him. He moved toward the newer section of wall, his sneakers scuffing softly against the concrete. Up close he could see faint seams between the bricks, just enough to suggest a concealed doorway. His fingers traced the edges, feeling for a gap, a hinge, anything. That's when his light caught a glint of metal low to the ground, half buried beneath debris. It was a small latch, barely visible unless you were looking for it. Behind him, something shifted. Not a footstep this time, but the faint rustle of fabric, like someone brushing against the wall. He turned sharply, heart hammering, but again, only empty space. The tunnel beyond the doorway was a black void, his light unable to pierce more than a few yards in. Ethan crouched and pulled at the latch. It resisted at first, then gave with a sudden snap. A deep, hollow click echoed through the room, and the section of wall in front of him creaked inward just enough to reveal a narrow opening. A cold draft seeped out, carrying a smell unlike the rest of the basement, stale but tinged with something metallic. He hesitated, every instinct screaming to leave, yet his hand pressed against the hidden door, pushing it open wider. Beyond it, the light revealed a steep staircase descending into even deeper darkness. Somewhere below, faint and distant, came the sound of something moving, slow, steady, and getting closer. Ethan gripped the edge of the doorway, his knuckles white. The staircase seemed to sink endlessly, each step swallowed by shadow. The movement below grew clearer now, not just footsteps but the faint scrape of something being dragged. His breath came shallow, and for a moment he considered shutting the hidden door and walking away, but curiosity had its claws in him. He stepped onto the first creaking stair, the wood bending slightly under his weight. The temperature dropped with every step, the air thickening, pressing against his skin. His phone light swept across rough stone walls, revealing patches of moisture that glistened like dark stains. Halfway down, he spotted old wiring running along the wall, brittle and frayed. It disappeared into a small metal box that hung open, its contents rusted beyond recognition. Farther ahead, the stairs leveled out into a cramped hallway, barely wide enough for him to pass through without his shoulders brushing the walls. The sound was louder here. A dragging, rhythmic and slow, followed by the faintest tap, as if something metallic touched the ground at the end of each pull. Ethan's light flickered, forcing him to slap the side of his phone in frustration. When it steadied again, he saw it. The hallway ended at another door. This one was different, thick, reinforced, with a small barred window at eye level. He took a step closer, straining to see inside. Through the bars he caught only darkness until something moved. A pale shape shifted just beyond the light, slow and deliberate, as though it knew he was there. Then from the shadows, a low voice, hoarse, almost a whisper, spoke his name. Ethan froze, his grip tightening on the phone until the edges dug into his palm. The voice was faint but certain, someone down here knew him. His name echoed in the narrow hallway, curling in the cold air like smoke. He stepped closer to the barred window, forcing himself to peer through. At first the pale shape stayed still, almost blending with the darkness. Then it shifted again, revealing a gaunt face, the skin stretched tight over sharp bones. The eyes were wide, unblinking, reflecting the narrow beam of his light. "Who are you?" Ethan asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it raised one hand, thin, almost skeletal, and pressed it against the bars. There was a faint metallic clink as something small slid between the rusted rods and landed at Ethan's feet. He looked down. It was an old brass key, heavy and cold to the touch. "Use it," the voice rasped. "Before they come back." Ethan's pulse hammered. "Who?" he demanded, but the figure had already stepped back into the darkness, retreating until only silence remained. The hallway felt tighter now, as if the walls had shifted closer. He glanced over his shoulder, the sense of being watched growing sharper with each passing second. The dragging sound had stopped, but in its place came a new noise, a faint shuffling from somewhere behind him, moving steadily closer. His eyes darted between the key in his hand and the door in front of him. Whatever choice he made, he knew he had only seconds before the thing in the tunnel reached him. The shuffling was closer now, steady and deliberate, like someone dragging their feet over stone. Ethan's hands trembled as he slid the key into the lock. The metal resisted at first, then turned with a reluctant click that echoed far too loudly in the narrow hallway. He pulled the door open just enough to slip inside, shutting it quickly behind him. The darkness here was thicker, swallowing the beam of his phone until it felt like he was standing in a void. He took a few cautious steps forward, his sneakers brushing against something soft, a layer of dust or maybe fabric scattered across the floor. As his eyes adjusted, faint shapes began to take form. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with jars, each sealed tight and coated with grime. He moved closer, brushing away the dust on one. The jar was filled with folded slips of paper, each marked with dates in the same neat handwriting he'd seen in the leather notebook. Some were decades old. At the far end of the room, a faint light glowed from under another door, this one much smaller, like an access hatch. As he approached, the air grew colder, carrying a faint hum, almost mechanical. He crouched and touched the metal handle. It was warm. From behind him came a muffled thud, followed by the unmistakable sound of the door's latch being tested. Something was trying to get in. Ethan's chest tightened. He glanced at the glowing hatch in front of him, then back toward the heavy door. He didn't know what was worse, staying to face whatever had followed him, or opening a door that clearly wasn't meant to be opened. Ethan's heartbeat thundered in his ears as the latch on the heavy door rattled again, harder this time. Dust shook loose from the ceiling, drifting down through the thin beam of his flashlight. The glow beneath the small hatch pulsed faintly, as if responding to his presence. He gripped the warm handle, his palm damp with sweat, and pulled. The hatch resisted, then swung open with a low groan. A rush of warmer air spilled out, carrying with it a strange mix of scents, oil, metal, and something faintly sweet. Inside was a narrow shaft, barely wide enough to crawl through, lit at intervals by dim bulbs strung along the walls. The faint hum he'd heard earlier was louder now, vibrating in his bones. Behind him, the heavy door shuddered. A deep, slow scrape followed, like claws dragging over steel. The sound was patient, deliberate, as though whatever was out there knew he had nowhere else to go. Ethan climbed into the shaft, his shoulders brushing the cold metal as he pulled the hatch shut behind him. The latch clicked into place just as the heavy door outside slammed open, the noise reverberating through the walls. He didn't stop to listen. The shaft angled downward, and soon the light from the hatch was gone. He crawled toward the faint glow ahead, each movement echoing in the confined space. At the far end, the tunnel opened into a small underground chamber, and what he saw froze him in place. It wasn't empty. In the center stood a tall, thin man in a dark coat, his face hidden in shadow just like in the photographs. And in his hands was another brass key, dangling slowly as if he'd been waiting for a long moment. Neither of them moved. The dim light swayed gently from a bulb overhead, casting the man's shadow across the floor in long, jagged lines. Ethan's throat felt dry, his every instinct screaming to turn back, but the narrow shaft behind him was now silent and sealed. The man tilted his head, the faintest smile forming in the darkness. The brass key in his hand caught the light, spinning slowly on its ring. "You've come farther than most," he said, his voice calm, almost conversational. "Now you have a choice." Ethan didn't answer. He wasn't sure he could. His gaze flicked between the key, the shadowed corners of the room, and the single door behind the man, the only other way out. Whatever happened next would never make sense to anyone on the outside. Some doors, once opened, can't be shut again. And some tunnels lead you places you were never meant to find. If you want to know what was behind that last door, you'll have to step inside with him. Make sure you subscribe, turn on notifications, and share this story with someone who loves a mystery they can't quite solve, because the next one may be even deeper underground.